Well, we had that privilege this week of ministering to the children in Vacation Bible School. It was awesome to watch the kids running around here and interacting with some of the adults and have them ask questions about, who Jesus is and what he's done for us and what he offers us, that gift of salvation, and how Jesus went to the cross and took our punishment and took that punishment so we don't have to endure that punishment that our sin righteously deserves. And then what to do after that. And in fact, some of the kids even came up and asked, how do we do that? And it was a great privilege to answer those questions and to see the lights start to come on. And we then had the privilege of teaching them what to do afterwards, And I always like that growth acrostic because I got a short memory. So I talked about going to God in prayer and reading his word and observing the command to come to worship every Sunday and witnessing to your friends and a couple other of those basic techniques that we have. As adults, we call those the spiritual disciplines that help us know God better. But this week, I want to start a message series that goes a little deeper than that. We're going to call this next 4 weeks Intimacy with God. And we're going to talk about the disciplines that are almost like a second level of discipline in building a relationship with God. We're going to talk about taking a couple of those things a little bit deeper than we took them earlier. We're going to talk about a deeper form of prayer. We're going to talk about some new things that we don't talk about very often. We're going to talk about meditation in a couple of weeks and how Christians can meditate on the Word of God. This week, I want to introduce the concept of silence. And we're going to do that by looking at the passage that Kevin read for us here just a little bit ago. It's 1 Kings chapter 19, and we're going to start at verse 9 if you would like to go ahead and turn there. I want to answer the question, how do we hear from God over the drone of everyday life? And we all have that drone in everyday life, don't we? We have that noise in the background. I first became aware of it when we moved from Kansas City to eastern Colorado. We were on the high plains of Colorado in a little village that had fewer people in the village than we have in the building right now. And every evening when the sun was going down, my ears would start to ring because it would get real quiet. And I hadn't realized up to that point that being in a big city like Kansas City, the noise level was so consistent, and in my case, so loud, that it was actually damaging my ears. And it wasn't until I got someplace quiet that I began to realize just what quiet really is. In our lives, we see this in other ways. Mothers, I think, have one of the hardest challenges getting over the drone of life because they have children. Little children, I've learned that this week. Little children can command a lot of attention. They tend to demand, they get louder when they don't get what they want. And mothers have a tendency to be the one who takes the brunt of that. It can distract from good things that can happen. Men have similar challenges. Usually it's associated with their work. I may have told you already, I got a friend who just recently changed jobs. He went to work with one of the contractors out at Vance Air Force Base, and when he applied for the job, they told him, you'll be expected to work 60 hours a week. And that was okay with him as long as he got Sundays off, so they arranged it so he can have his Sundays off to do his ministry in the church. But what they didn't tell him was that 60 hours was the minimum. And to this point, he has not had a single week where he hasn't worked 80 hours. And our current work environment demands more and more of these guys who are paid by the hour to work more because it's cheaper to work a guy double time than it is to pay another employee to do the work. As we get older and our kids get grown up and they leave the house, then we get to build these new relationships. Some of you know what I'm talking about here. Those new people who want to be our best friends. Most of the time we call them doctors. And we end up spending more and more and more time trying to schedule to get into this clinic or that x-ray or that laboratory to take care of what the doctors want. And it just makes it difficult to find a time when there's not distractions to focus on. And singles have the same challenges. They just have to face them alone. How did the Bible characters arrange it so they could hear Jesus, hear God over the drone of life, the noise that cancels out the voice of God? We can learn a few things from Elijah's story here in 1 Kings. We find out that Elijah has been traveling. The first verse here, verse 9 says, and there he came to a cave. Now, where did he come to? Where's there? He came to Mount Horeb. This is the mountain that Moses received the Ten Commandments from God on. Elijah has had to flee Israel. Most of us remember the story. We hear it from very early on in Sunday school. Elijah called together Ahab and all of the prophets of the false gods. There are 850 prophets of Baal and Astaroth there that were leading the people astray. And so after a drought, Elijah calls this meeting, and they decide who the real God is. And it turns out to be the one true God, the God of the Bible, who sent fire down from heaven to consume the sacrifice on the altar. Well, the next day wasn't a good day. The next day, Jezebel, who was the real sponsor of all these prophets, decided she was going to get back at Elijah and threatened his life, so he decided it was a good time to get out of town. And he fled. He went south. He went through Jerusalem, down about halfway or two-thirds of the way down through the Arabian Peninsula to the mountain of God. And when he got there, he found a cave. And he stayed in that cave. He lodged in that cave, it says in my version of the Bible. Here it says, and behold, the word of the Lord came to him and said to him, what are you doing here, Elijah? And Elijah said, I have been very jealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the people of Israel have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. And I, even I only am left, and they seek my life to take it away. What we have here is Elijah's excuse. And it sounded pretty good to Elijah. You know, I went and I did this. I had this huge meeting. We had this, was supposed to be a national revival. And now I'm the only one left and they want to kill me. That's why I'm not where you expected me to be. That's not why I'm not where you can use me. And to Elijah, that sounded pretty good. And I think we have that challenge sometimes too. It's pretty easy to find an excuse not to listen to God, not to find that place, that time when we can hear God and only God, because we've got good excuses. I've got long hours at work. I've got 4 kids. I've got baseball to go to, or I've got softball to go to, or I've got these work parties to go to. There's all kinds of things that can crowd in on our schedule and take away that chance to hear what God is saying. I find it interesting as we work through this, God doesn't address that excuse until way at the end. I'll get to that in just a moment. The next thing that Elijah learned about, or that we learn from Elijah about hearing from God, is that God reveals himself to us in subtle ways, not dramatic ways. After giving his excuse, verse 11 says, and he said, go out and stand on the mount before the Lord. And behold, the Lord passed by, and a great and strong wind tore the mountain and broke in pieces the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire. But the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, the sound of a low whisper. A couple of things stand out to me about that. First, right at the beginning, it says, the Lord passed by. The Lord passed by. Somehow Elijah knew that the Lord had gone in front of him. And then there's that little conjunction. I've learned to watch for those. And I looked that word up. Another way to translate is sequential. And then, in other words, after the Lord had passed by, then came the wind. And then came the earthquake. And then came the fire. But the Lord had already passed by. He wasn't in those things. These would have been significant illustrations to Elijah. It was with a mighty wind that God had parted the Red Sea so that the people of Israel could march across on dry land. And it was when the wind was withdrawn that the strongest army in history to that date, the special forces, so to speak, of King Pharaoh were killed as the water came back by, securing the next 40 years for the people to wander in the wilderness. It was with an earthquake when the other Levites rose in rebellion against Moses and Aaron that God said, separate yourself from them. And the earth opened and those people went down into Sheol alive. And then the earth closed over them. Just a few days before, Elijah had been on Mount Carmel where he had built the altar and put the pieces of the sacrifice on the altar, and God sent fire down to consume that. Elijah had experienced that himself. These were demonstrations of God's power, God's ability to do things that were necessary for his people. But they were not demonstrations of his presence. It says that then there came a low whisper. The King James says a still small voice. Hebrew sometimes, because it doesn't have quite as legalistic a arrangement of word order, sometimes can touch our hearts a little bit easier as they rearrange the words. In Hebrew, the words are arranged a voice, still and small, almost as if to calm him. And that's when Elijah realized he was in the presence of God. God reveals himself to us in subtler ways too. Recently, we've read that book, Ordinary Disciples, and people continue to ask me why we don't see miracles like they are recorded in that book. Overseas, they're seeing miracles. These are in places where pagan gods rule. And the need to demonstrate the power of God is there. I think in our culture, we need to represent the nearness of God more than the power of God, since we rarely compete with idols. We need to look for the subtle ways that God is revealing himself to us, the quieter ways. And when we do, just like Elijah, when he listened to God, God revealed what God wanted Elijah to know about his plans. We'll skip down to verse 15 here and see what God says to Elijah. And the Lord said to him, "Go, return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus. And when you arrive, you shall anoint Hazael to be king over Syria, and Jehu, the son of Nimshi, you shall anoint to be king over Israel, and Elisha, the son of Shaphat of Abel-Mahalah, you shall anoint to be prophet in your place. And the one who escapes from the sword of Hazael shall Jehu put to death, and the one who escapes from the sword of Jehu shall Elisha put to death." Now, just subtly here, notice that there's going to be some putting to death. Okay? But it's not going to be Elijah that's put to death. That was Elijah's excuse. I get a buy on being where I'm supposed to be because they're trying to kill me. Well, God is saying, not only are they not going to kill you, but you're going to be instrumental in changing the power structure so that that no longer becomes a problem. First, you go from where you are, which is way down south of Judah, the southern kingdom of Israel. You go all the way from there through Judah, through Samaria, all the way to Damascus. It's almost the other end of the map, so to speak. And you anoint a new king in Syria. And that way the Syrians will stop harassing Israel quite so much. And then you anoint a new king over Israel, over Samaria. Because it's the present king and queen that are trying to kill you. And so you're going to be instrumental in appointing a new king so that people can safely follow God. And if you keep following this book through, at the beginning of the next book, actually 2 Kings, Elijah is essentially raptured off the planet. He's taken up to heaven in a chariot of fire. And right before that, he has spent several days traveling from one camp to another where they were training prophets, schools of prophets. In other words, through Elijah's work, there will be a reformation, a return to training people to teach others how to follow God. And he will live to see it. Now, it'd be nice, I'm sure Elijah would have thought it'd be nice if God would give me some more detail. What road should I take north? How do I get my appointment with these guys to anoint them? What do I say to them? He doesn't give us those details. He wants Elijah to trust him and simply go and be guided as he goes. Sometimes we wish God would reveal things to us that we don't know yet. I saw this, I don't know if this is a good illustration or not, but I'm going to use it anyway. Earlier this week, we started Vacation Bible School, and there's a lot of, not as much as sometimes, but considerable amount of anxiety. Do we have enough material for all the kids that are going to come? How many kids should we plan for? Well, God didn't tell us. God just said, trust me. I'll bring the kids. And he did. And we had some great interactions with those kids. But we had to trust him. Just like Elijah had to trust God to lead him to carry out his instructions properly. The last thing we see as Elijah listens to the voice of God is that he ended up encouraged. The last verse here, verse 18, God is still speaking, says, "Yet I will leave 7,000 in Israel, all the knees that have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him." That's God's way of saying, you only think you're the only one. You only feel that way. There's 7,000 people in the nation of Israel that are still on your side. With that encouragement, get up and go. Now, the point is, it's at least theoretically possible now for people to hear the voice of God. So how can we increase our chances of hearing him? We do it the same way that Elijah did. You have to find a place of silence and solitude where there aren't distractions, where it's easier at least to focus. We've got to get away from the drone. Jesus taught us a great deal of how to do that. He called it the prayer closet in Matthew 6:6. He said to them as he was introducing the principles of his new kingdom, he said, "But when you pray, go into your room and shut the door and pray to your Father who is in secret. And your Father who sees in secret will reward you." I find that little word room interesting. Whenever I read multiple translations and the words are translated in different ways, I always go and look those words up. And that word room in King James is translated closet. So I went and found out what this word actually described. And the Greeks would use this word to describe a room that was built in the center of a house. and all the other rooms were built around that room. It might actually be like a broom closet, or it might be like a pantry where you would store your groceries, or if you were a craftsman, it might be where you store your raw materials. It's a place where you don't have a lot of distraction or exposure to the elements. What Jesus is saying when you pray, go into that place where there are no windows. That's the key point in all the lexicons about this word. It doesn't have windows. So you can't be seen, and other people can't see you. Because when other people see you, that's when they walk up to the window and want to check out what happened last night or what you're planning to do this evening, or ask you questions about your field of expertise, and you lose your focus. This was a key principle in Jesus' life. All the Bible writers talk about it, but Mark and Luke include this early in their Gospels. In chapter 1 of Mark's Gospel, Jesus has just had a whole day where he has spent time healing people, and as he wakes up the next day, he gets up early, and he goes out while it's still dark, and departs and goes to a desolate place. When I read that word desolate, I tend to think of a desert. And because I'm American, I think of the American Southwest, where those deserts are, where you have these real pretty mountains in the distance, and you got these cactus, and you got these lizards crawling all over the place, and there's a lot of things to see in an American desert. The Greek word desert can also be, or desolate in this case, can also be translated abandoned. And Jesus gets up in the morning while it's still dark, while he can't see anything and people can't see him, and he goes someplace that's abandoned. There's nothing living there at all. There's not even stones the shape of a loaf of bread so that he can be distracted by his appetite. And he spends time talking to his Father. Luke is even stronger about it in chapter 5, verse 16. He says that Jesus would withdraw to desolate places and pray. Same word for desolate there, places where he wouldn't be distracted. But what caught my attention in this case was the words would withdraw. And because I am who I am, I went and looked in the Greek, and those two words are the verb phrase that have a tense in Greek that doesn't exist in English. It's called the imperfect tense. And I didn't know what that was, so I went and looked it up, and I found out that imperfect means something that has started in the past and habitually continues into the future. It's talking about lifestyle and habit, things that you would expect to do. And what Luke is saying here is it was a common thing for Jesus to leave the drone of his ministry and go somewhere where he could talk to God. So much so that I think it probably frustrated the disciples. They wake up in the morning and look over there where Jesus went to bed last night, and he's not there. Peter probably poked John and said, "Hey, John, it was your turn to watch him. He got away again. Does anybody know where he went? Now we got to go find Jesus again." Jesus made a habit out of personal contact with his Father. And he's illustrating that we can too. We can make a habit out of that personal conversation between us and God. But how can we be successful in the 21st century where we can't even get into our car without the radio coming on and filling our ears with some other noise? Well, I want to suggest two things, and these are going to be new concepts to most of you, but these will help you hear the voice of God. The first is what I call spousal cooperation. We have to work together so that we can each hear the voice of God. And there's a reason for that. Ladies, did you know that your husband is brain damaged? That got some people looking up. Some of the women just snapped their head up in the air. Really? My husband's brain? Some of the men looked up like, "What you talking about?" It's true. As little boys, right before we're born, There is a chemical that is placed around the child that is not placed around little girls. And it has the sole function of separating the connection between the left side of the brain and the right side of the brain. And that's what gives men the ability to hyper-focus. Because God knew that in some places in history, men were going to have to be able to focus very carefully on that deer over there, because if I don't kill that deer, my family's not going to eat. Or they had to focus very carefully on getting the plants planted properly so that they grow and my family has food for the winter. That means that he can only focus on one thing at a time. And when you see your husband going into his, whatever his prayer closet is, you have the privilege of ministering to him by telling the kids, shh, Dad's talking to God. Let's not bother him for a little bit. Now, guys, you have the same privilege. When you see your wife go into her prayer closet, she does not have that break between the right and left hemispheres of her brain. And when she goes in there and she hears one of the babies cry or one of the kids ask a question, she automatically hears that, and it draws her attention away from God because she has to go and help the child. Or she's struggling not to think about the floors she has to sweep, or the vacuum she has to empty, or the dishes she has to do. And we have the privilege as guys to take those distractions away from her because she does something we don't do very well. She multitasks. She can think of lots of things. And we want to take those distractions away from her so she can hear the voice of God. There is one other suggestion that I can make this morning, and I almost hesitate to do this because it involves using what may be the worst possible word in the English language. That word is discipline. We may have to, in fact, I'm quite confident that we'll get to that point eventually, where we have to just put our foot down and say, we're not going to be distracted. It doesn't matter that that movie's only in town one night. It doesn't matter that the school has that program that one morning. It doesn't matter that the boss wants us to work that extra hour of overtime. If that's our time with God, we may have to put our foot down. We may have to actually demonstrate that hearing from God is the greatest priority in our life. And the hardest part of all, trust Him to come through. Trust Him to protect us as we protect our time with Him. And I'm going to tell you something. I'm going to give you a guarantee that you won't get anywhere else. I will return double your money of admission this morning if you don't eventually hear from God if you make this commitment. Some of you will get that joke in the morning, okay? Nobody paid admission this morning, did you? This is free, just like our access to God is free. Just like His promise to speak to us is free. I don't know how you'll experience that. Personally, I don't remember ever hearing an actual audible voice where the sound came into my ears and through my inner ear and through my nervous system into my brain. But I can tell you that there is a sweetness of communion there, an anticipation of communion there that makes me not want to leave when I experience it. Somehow my heart knows I'm in the presence of God, and I enjoy it. God may bring Bible verses to your attention. God may actually speak directly to you. He may bring words of encouragement or correction of ideas that you've not experienced before. You may suddenly feel that you have value to God that you hadn't felt before. Somehow, if you make the commitment, God will meet you. And as you do, as you hear from him and you experience him, you will get to know him better. In one sense, it gets easier to hear from him with experience. In another sense, you just know the rest of the day, this is what he would think about this. This is how he would respond. This is how he would want me to respond. Because silence facilitates a more intimate relationship with God. And even though it's a little bit more advanced than the typical prayer and read the Bible and go to worship, it's something that each one of us can do if we're willing to be committed to it. And we receive the help from those around us that we need to simply be quiet enough to hear God speak.